Welcome. In this video on totalitarianism, we will conclude this unit by addressing the aggression of the dictator states prior to World War II. Why do we see aggression in this period, and why is it so successful for so long? Many of the countries after World War I had what we could call a war hangover. World War I was so bad that there was this unwillingness to ever consider war again, such as the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact, where they decided they swore never to use war as a tool again. Many states were convinced that no sane person could ever want another major war after how awful World War I was. But some countries were satisfied and others were very dissatisfied with how World War I had gone. And Germany to the greatest extent, but also several other countries, felt that the world order of the Treaty of Versailles had left them out, or left them feeling unsatisfied, and they wanted a change, and they believed that military aggression was the way to effect that change. And then you have the Great Depression, which is another reason that the democracies do not want war. They feel as if, the economy is poor and they don't want to waste money on military spending at that time. But in this context, you will see the dictator states use aggression as a tool to get what they want. We're going to look at Japan, Italy, and of course Nazi Germany. Japan recognized in the mid-1800s they were a weak, backward power, and Emperor Mushohito proclaimed Meiji in the late 1800s. And though it was an island with a large population, it had very few resources. But they successfully imitated other successful, rich, advancing countries and were very quick to become a top 10 world power in just a few decades. What did they do as they imitated European countries in industrialization and capitalism and other methods? They imitated them in imperialism as well. And they conquered most of Korea in the early 1900s and won a war against Russia at the time. Also, those who study World War II, when you ask what year did it begin, well, it started September 1st, 1939, except for China and Japan, because Japan invaded China, or at least the province of Manchuria, as early as 1931. And the war between Japan and China starts as early as 1931 and continues almost continuously through the end of World War II. So there's almost 8 years of World War II that's happening before anyone really even calls it part of World War II. They invade other chunks of mainland China, not just the northern part called Manchuria, but the rest of China as best they can. It's very large, so they never take over all of China, but most of the large cities and population are in the eastern half. One particularly nasty battle is called the Rape of Nanking, where there was people who surrendered. Men were shot, women were raped, the city was wrecked, and it was a episode that, in what is becoming very much closer to the modern world, it was a particularly shocking and barbaric attack on a city that the Japanese had already captured. So this was not the Chinese army. This was a city that the Japanese army captured and proceeded to rape and sack through the town. This is going on in the midst of a Chinese civil war between the communists under Mao and the nationalists under Chiang. And we could go into that some other time, but China is in the midst of a terrible war, of a civil war that was emerging, and into that context, Japan launches a terrible war. The League of Nations condemns the Japanese attack, so Japan withdraws from the League of Nations and decides that they don't need to be a member state any longer. And the key leaders of Imperial Japan is their premier, their prime minister, Hideki Tojo, who many credit being the real mastermind, the Mussolini, the Hitler, though not quite as bad a figure as Hitler or Stalin. The emperor people perceive as largely a figurehead. Emperor Hirohito has again been sidelined, much as the emperors were under the Tokugawa period. And finally, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who is the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, which we'll talk about next unit. Admiral Yamamoto is one of the top military commanders. He himself had spent time in America, and the plan that he executed and really devastated the United States Navy at Pearl Harbor, the successful surprise attack that he masterminded so well, he was against the idea. As someone who had been to America, he believed war against America was a bad idea, but being a loyal soldier, he did as he was told to do. Though in American circles, he was in many ways public enemy number one as the man who planned the Pearl Harbor attack and who guided the military itself, particularly the Navy, which for Americans, again, was public enemy number one. Italy, in the mid-1930s, invades Ethiopia. Again, they had unsuccessfully attacked Ethiopia about 40 years prior, which was, for racial reasons, very embarrassing as a European state to be defeated by an African state in a period in which many people so fanatically and almost pseudo-scientifically believed in racism as a natural truth. For a European power like Italy to be defeated by an African one was seen as an extraordinary failure. But Ethiopia was a relatively advanced nation compared to others in the world. And the king of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, went to the League of Nations and gave an eloquent plea for help. And they fell on deaf ears. The League voted for weak trade sanctions. They were in the midst of the Depression. Nobody wanted war. And so without help, Italy, see, Ethiopia had a modernized army of rifles and some machine guns, but Italy now had airplanes, tanks, and truly modern weapons of war. Ethiopia begged Britain to at least close the Suez Canal, which the Italians were dependent on to send all their supplies and reinforcements to Ethiopia. Without the Suez Canal, the Italians would have had to go all the way around the tip of Africa to reinforce their troops in Ethiopia, and Britain would not even do that. And so the democracies stand idly by while another neutral country is attacked and conquered. Partly, they probably would have felt hypocritical condemning Italy's attack on Ethiopia when major players like Britain and France have large African empires of their own. And of course, Mussolini played on that and accused them of hypocrisy, that Italy cannot have an African empire when everyone, all the great powers in Europe had their own African empire, and it would be hypocritical to deny them the opportunity to make war on Ethiopia. And finally, Germany. Hitler begins to systematically dismantle the Treaty of Versailles. From 1932 and on, they begin a rearmament program, building submarines, building heavy artillery, rebuilding the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, with bombers and a large number of fighters, rearming the German army with high numbers and building tanks called Panzers, a German word for tanks. He begins to press the land claims, that claim for Irredenta, land where Germans live but is outside of the nation state of Germany, outside the Reich, that if they're German and we're German, they belong to Germany. Also Lebensraum, the idea of living space or breathing room, the idea that Germany was a vibrant power who deserved and needed more land to survive. He breaks the Treaty of Versailles by sending troops to reoccupy the Rhineland, this territory between the Rhine River and their border with France. He sends troops there, and France does nothing. They want Britain to join with them and stand up to Germany and reject this. Hitler later admitted this was the time he was most scared that the Western Allies would stand up to him, and his army was still too weak at that point, that he would have had to back down and rethink everything. But they did nothing in 1936, and so he continued his rearmament. He signs an alliance with Italy called the Rome-Berlin Axis, eventually the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis, with the idea that Rome and Berlin kind of sit on this vertical line, that Europe would rotate on that axis around Rome-Berlin. Adding in Tokyo was more practical than fitting with that symbolism of the name, but the name stuck. In 1938, civil war breaks out in Spain between the nationalists, who are borderline fascists, and the communists. And what you saw in the Spanish Civil War was the backing of Nazis of Generalissimo Francisco Franco. And Franco, the fascist nationalist leader, gains control of Spain. But the type of fighting you saw in 1938 and 1939 was nothing like World War I, and was more like a dress rehearsal for World War II, with air power, tanks, breakthrough, and there are those who recognized it as a warning sign that the next war would be very different from the last one, though not everyone had the ears to hear it. The German aggression leading up to the war, up to their invasion of Poland, is met time and again with appeasement, or giving in to an aggressor. In March of 1938, they made demands over Austria called the Anschluss. Anschluss means union. Basically, the Austrians speak German. Austria used to have this great Habsburg Empire, and now they're this tiny rump of a country. There's a fascist pro-Nazi party in Austria. The German army, per their invitation, after the German Austrians claim that they want the German army to protect them, they move in. They hold a plebiscite, a vote of all the people on a single issue. Do you want union with Germany? And due to intimidation of the army and the Gestapo and the brown shirts and the native Austrian Nazi party, by a huge margin, they vote for union with Germany, and they do it. This was specifically banned by the Treaty of Versailles, yet no one did anything. In Czechoslovakia, there's a region called the Sudetenland. This is the part of Czechoslovakia where a large number of the people who live in the Sudetenland are German-speaking Czechs. Hitler demands them. He claims this is their Irredenta. They're German, we're German, we want it. And to the German city of Munich go leaders of the four large powers to sign a pact or deal. Hitler himself, Prime Minister of England, Neville Chamberlain, the ruler of fascist Italy, Benito Mussolini, and the French Premier, Edouard Daladier. There they did, and notice who's missing, anyone from Czechoslovakia. There they decide that Germany can take the Sudetenland as long as they agree to take nothing else from Czechoslovakia, even though it decimates the population, the economy, the resources. It takes a huge chunk away from Czechoslovakia, but the British believe it is peace for our time, that this is the last thing Hitler will ever want, and that we have solved the Irredenta problem of Germany and have prevented another terrible war. But just 6 months later, Germany marches in and annexes rump Czechoslovakia, the rest that was left over, and the government kind of concedes. There was a movement even among non-German speaking Czechs that they sympathize and wanted this, and the Nazis play this up, and they send in their army and annex the rest of Czechoslovakia. This led the Western Allies to recognize the failure of appeasement. Giving the Germans what they want has resulted in loss after loss after loss. In the Rhineland, in Austria, Sudetenland, the rest of Czechoslovakia, giving Hitler what he wanted is not working out. And then the world is shocked in 1939 as news of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact becomes public. This is a Nazi-Soviet, a German-Russian non-aggression pact, a 10-year non-aggression pact, which shocked the world. These were two, the only people that Hitler preached hate against more than the Jews, or nearly as much as the Jews, were the communists. And so this shocked the world that these two groups could somehow find common ground. But the treaty contained secret provisions that in the event of war with Poland, the other would turn a blind eye or even join, and that they would divide all of Polish territory among themselves, which is ultimately really why they wanted this deal. This is what happens immediately prior to the Second World War. Thanks for watching.